This opening move, 1. e4, immediately challenges the center by occupying a crucial square and opens lines for both the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for dynamic and often tactical play. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and unbalanced opening aiming to create asymmetrical pawn structures and fighting chances. For black, this move develops a knight towards the center and prepares to control key squares, supporting a potential d4 pawn push and reinforcing the e4 pawn, which is standard in many Sicilian defense variations. This move transitions into the classical Sicilian defense, aiming to control the center with the d-pawn while preparing to develop the bishop and queen. This move immediately challenges black's central pawn and aims to open lines, directly entering the main lines of the open Sicilian defense. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a fundamental response that embraces central pawn tension and opens lines for piece development. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a theoretically rich and complex defense where white aims for rapid piece development and central control while black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside. This developing move, 4, nf6, challenges white's central knight and aims to continue piece development, a standard principle in the open Sicilian. This move weakens the dark squares around your king and hinders the development of your kingside bishop. While white's standard plan in this Sicilian defense variation involves developing pieces rapidly and preparing a central pawn break, this move seizes central space and challenges white's knight, forcing a decision on its future placement and aiming to gain a tempo in the development process. This move, b-flat 5+, initiates a common tactical sequence in the Sicilian dragon or accelerated dragon variations, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially gain an early initiative by forcing a recapture that exposes black's king or creates weaknesses. This move reinforces the pawn chain and prepares to develop the king's bishop, a standard response in the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian defense to avoid material loss after the check. This move sacrifices a knight for positional advantage, forcing black to either recapture with the d-pawn, creating an isolated pawn, or allow white's knight to penetrate further into the position. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn and opens the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's knight on f5 and gain queenside space. This move resolves the central tension, opening lines and creating a pawn majority for white in the center while black's knight on d7 is now pinned to the queen. This move directly challenges the white bishop, aiming to gain space on the queenside and potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn structure. After the bishop retreats, this exchange simplifies the pawn structure and clarifies white's development by removing a defender, preparing to exploit the open central files. Capturing the bishop with the queen on d7 recaptures the material lost and centralizes the queen, which can be actively used to support the queenside pawn advance or participate in the fight for the d5 square. This move repositions the knight to a safer square while preparing to contest the center and potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside. The bishop on c5 now actively pressures the d4 pawn and prepares to castle, improving piece coordination and central control. This move solidifies white's central pawn control and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, aiming for a more robust pawn structure and active piece play. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to gain queenside space, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses for white's pieces. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares to develop the queenside pieces. aiming to contest the queenside expansion black has initiated. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks. A fundamental step in mobilizing pieces after opening development. Castling kingside secures the monarch and connects the rooks. A standard maneuver following black's commitment to a central pawn push in development. This move exchanges a central pawn for a wing pawn, weakening black's queenside pawn structure by creating isolated pawns on c4 and a6. This move is a prophylactic maneuver, creating an escape square for the king on h1 should black manage to open lines on the kingside. And it also supports a potential kingside pawn advance like g4 in the future. This exchange simplifies white's pawn structure and opens the b-file. But it also removes a key defender of white's king and allows black's queen to occupy a more active central post. This exchange of bishops is a strategic decision to simplify the position and eliminate black's active bishop on circa 5, which was putting pressure on white's queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the long dark squared diagonal and potentially support a kingside attack or pressure white's center. This move establishes a strong central passed pawn and restricts black's queenside development, aiming to control key squares and create long-term positional pressure. This move activates the rook to the semi-open c-file, challenging white's control and preparing for potential pressure on white's queenside pawns. This move pins the knight on f6 to the queen, increasing pressure on black's center and potentially creating tactical opportunities along the diagonal. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to control the d5 square and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside, while also preparing to defend the e6 pawn. The move 18, qd2 centralizes the queen, supports the knight on e3, and prepares to potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside or in black's pawn structure. This move strategically places the rook on a central file, preparing to challenge white's advanced pawn and open lines for counterplay. This move repositions the rook to the d-file, contesting the open file and preparing to support central pawn advances or a potential rook lift. This move prepares to contest the d-file and potentially reinforce the c6 square, addressing white's centralized pawn on d6. This exchange of bishops fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a doubled pawn for black on the c-file and opening the d-file for white's rooks. This move, 20, rdx d6, captures the pawn on d6, opening the d-file and forcing white to reconsider the advanced d6 pawn, which was a central attacking point. The move 21, qg5, is a strong centralizing maneuver aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and prepare for an attack on the kingside, while also eyeing the d6 pawn. This recapture on f6 is necessary to avoid losing material, as white's bishop on e3 was indirectly attacking the queen. Exchanging queens simplifies the position and leads to a rook endgame, where white hopes to exploit their queenside pawn majority and open files. This pawn capture recreates pawn islands, potentially creating weaknesses that black can target in the endgame. This exchange simplifies the position, giving white a clear advantage in the resulting rook endgame due to the opponent's compromised pawn structure and black's exposed king. This exchange simplifies the position, leading to a rook endgame where white's doubled pawns on the d-file create weaknesses that black can exploit. This rook move aims to establish control of the open d-file and potentially exert pressure on black's weakened queenside pawn structure. This exchange simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white has a pawn majority on the kingside versus black's majority on the queenside. This move initiates an endgame where white aims to leverage the central control in the activity of the knight against black's potentially weakened kingside pawn structure. The bishop retreats to d5, solidifying control over the light squares and preparing to support the passed pawn on d6. The king retreats to the safety of the corner, preparing to participate in the endgame by moving towards the center. This move aims to challenge white's centralized pawn on d6 and potentially create an active passed pawn on the queenside, while also preventing white from developing their king further. This move repositions the king towards the center, aiming to activate it in the endgame and potentially support pawn advances or control key central squares. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the h-file while opening lines for black's rook. nc3 aims to reposition the knight to a more active central square, potentially eyeing the weak pawn on f4 or preparing to support a kingside advance. This move re-establishes the bishop's control over the c6-f3 diagonal and prepares to support the pawn push to f4, aiming to restrict white's knight mobility. The move g3 aims to improve the king's safety by creating an escape square, while also preparing to potentially use the g-file for rook activity if the opportunity arises. This exchange opens up the g-file for black's rook and aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside. After recapturing, this pawn recapture opens the h-file for white's rook, providing potential attacking possibilities along this open line against black's king, while also creating a passed pawn on g3 that requires careful management. The king centralizes to participate in the endgame, aiming to support the passed pawn and potentially contest the d-file. This move aims to improve the king's safety and mobility by creating an escape square on g7 and potentially preparing for future pawn advances on the kingside. This move prepares to control the a4 square, preventing black from creating any potential counterplay on the queenside while consolidating white's position. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to contest the central dark squares and support potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the weak pawns on the kingside. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially preparing to support pawn advances on the kingside or control central squares more effectively. This exchange simplifies the position, removing the bishop that was putting pressure on white's kingside pawns, and opens the way for black's king to become more active, though white retains a central pawn majority. The exchange sacrifice has led to a king-centric endgame where white's king now actively participates, aiming to support the queenside pawns while black's king must also venture out to contest them. This pawn check is forced, creating an open file for white's king while aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. This recapture opens the kingside and central files, forcing an exchange and simplifying into a materially level endgame where black's passed pawn is aggressively advanced but white's king is centralized. With the pawn structure simplified, black's king must actively participate in the endgame, aiming to support its remaining pawns and create potential counterplay. This move is aimed at consolidating white's pawn majority on the queenside and creating a protected passed pawn on the a-file, which is a crucial strategic objective in this endgame. This pawn advance shores up the queenside pawn structure, preventing white's king from penetrating further and maintaining a balanced pawn majority.